At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's Chikondi. Let's begin. The first indication that humanity's fate had just been decided was the sky over Geneva bleaching to the color of old bone. Sergeant Major Cormac Gage, Dr. Ellen Monroe, and Captain Iona Reed were attending a summit that possessed all the cheerful ambiance of a pre-execution sermon. For 43 agonizing days, every terrestrial telescope and deep space array tracked the inbound anomalies. The planet's governments, in a rare display of unified panic, had assembled their most formidable minds to formulate a response. The resulting plan was, thus far, a masterclass in collective hand-wringing. Now, standing on their hotel suite's balcony overlooking the lake, the debate became abruptly academic. The alien vessels didn't bother with anything so mundane as arrival. They impressed themselves upon reality, colossal shapes of absolute blackness that drank the morning light, each a void outlined in soft flowing luminescence. Beside them, the most advanced human aircraft would look like a child's poorly made balsa wood glider. Gage narrowed his eyes as the sun vanished, plunged into an unnatural twilight. Next to him, Reed, a pilot whose flight records read like a litany of formerly protested violations of physics, let out a long, appreciative whistle.
"Well, you don't see that every day,"
she murmured, leaning against the cold stone railing.
"Wonder if they do delivery."
Monroe, a woman who treated the fundamental forces of the universe as a personal intellectual foe, simply shoved her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Her lips were slightly parted, her expression one of ravenous scientific lust. Gage remained quiet. He'd encountered enough new in his career to understand it was usually just a synonym for lethal. Below them, the city found its voice, and it was a scream. A discordant orchestra of car alarms, the distant wail of emergency services, and the rising, panicked hum of thousands of voices echoed off the buildings. A new sound sliced through the din, a sonorous, melodic voice that bloomed from every speaker, every phone, every active screen on the planet. The English was flawless, if unsettlingly sterile. "You do not need to be afraid. We are the Sibelian Chorus. We are here to offer you passage." A planetary broadcast seized every channel. A tall, willowy being with large liquid eyes stood against a backdrop of unfamiliar constellations. Its posture radiated a sort of weary, ancient compassion. "For millennia, our chorus has listened for the echoes of a great predator, a shadow that hunts in the silent corners of the galaxy. We have charted the silence it leaves in its wake. It is a force that scours worlds to bedrock and memory." The view shifted. Elegant simulations depicted planets fracturing, their crusts peeling away like rotten fruit. Cities of glass and steel were shown flash-fired into smooth, glossy plains. Then came the fragments of recorded data. The footage was ancient, degraded, stuttering with corruption. It showed bipedal figures in what looked like crude, riveted plate armor, their movements a blur of terrifying close-quarters violence. They fought with a fury that felt less like warfare and more like a form of geological erosion. "We call them the Echoes," the alien envoy continued, its voice a soothing balm of galactic pity. "The oldest legends of our founding worlds are built upon the ruins they left behind. Now their migration of destruction brings them to this arm of the galaxy. Your world is in their path. You cannot hope to fight them, but you do not have to perish. We offer you a new home, a new song to sing among the stars. We offer you continuance." Reed snorted, crossing her arms.
"An unstoppable, all-consuming horde, huh? Gage, you think they're talking about my ex-mother-in-law?"
Gage's mouth didn't twitch. He just stared at the silent, world-eclipsing ships, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "I don't know who they're talking about," he said, his voice a low rasp, like gravel stirred with a shovel. "But I know one thing. Nobody ever offers you a lifeboat unless they're sure your own ship's already at the bottom of the ocean." The following days devolved into a week of frantic, globe-spanning debate. The chorus's proposal was direct. Designated populations, key specialists, and comprehensive cultural archives would be evacuated to their fleet, a seed of humanity preserved against the coming winter. A fragile coalition of North American and European states, staring at the incomprehensible power hanging over their heads like the ultimate sword of Damocles, capitulated. Gage, Reed, and Monroe found themselves on the manifest. They were processed through a hastily erected checkpoint beneath the oppressive shadow of a chorus transport vessel. The air was thick with the scent of superheated air and the faint, unsettling perfume of ionized candy mixed with the smell of collective human anxiety. Their liaison was the same alien from the broadcast, Luminar Olen of the Cybelian Chorus. In person, he was even taller, his movements possessing a fluid, boneless grace. His large, empathetic eyes, which Gage now recognized as the condescending gaze a wealthy woman might give a flea-bitten stray she was about to have neutered, swept over the human evacuees. He paused before the trio, consulting a device that resembled a pane of smoked glass.
"Ah, the designated outliers,"
Olin said, his voice the same melodic hum from the broadcast. He focused on Monroe.
"Dr. Ellen Monroe, your papers on applied physics and weaponized electromagnetism are curiously sophisticated for a species that has yet to master simple gravity manipulation. We wish to archive your methods."
He then turned his gaze to Reed.
"Captain Iona Reed, your pilot metrics show a statistical disregard for operational safety margins that borders on the pathological, a psychological case study of extreme value."
Finally, his liquid eyes settled on Gage.
"And Sergeant Major Cormac Gage, your service history is a perfect representation of the human conflict-driven social architecture, a prime specimen for our study of your species' tragic, self-destructive nature."
Monroe blinked, processing.
"So we're curiosities for your museum?"
"You are points of profound interest,"
Olin corrected, a gesture of his long-fingered hand indicating it was a compliment.
"chosen to help us comprehend the species we are endeavoring to save."
Gage, a man who saw the world as a series of tactical problems, cut through the pleasantries. "Luminar, you've got a big ship, an important mission, so why the skeleton crew?" He gestured with his chin at the sky where only a handful of smaller, sleeker vessels patrolled around the colossal flagship. A flicker, a micro-expression of something other than serene confidence crossed Olin's face.
"A calculated risk. Recent Ravager raids on our research outposts have grown bolder. They have acquired technology we believed was secure. Our primary defensive fleets are occupied."
Monroe pounced on the opening.
"Speaking of technology, your linguistic models are impeccable. Did you build them from our deep space transmissions?"
Olin offered a thin, indulgent smile.
"We have been monitoring your species' broadcasts for over a century. It was a challenge to construct a coherent linguistic framework from your reality television programs. A great deal of shrieking was involved."
He paused, a hint of genuine confusion in his eyes.
"Even your entertainment seems predicated on conflict and perplexing dominance displays. It all reinforces the preliminary sociological data we gathered."
He then gestured vaguely toward the east.
"We cannot comprehend why the Pan-Asian and Southern blocs are refusing our aid. Their intelligence services insist our arrival coincides with the inexplicable disappearance of their deep space probes. They maintain this is a deception. A Trojan horse is the phrase, I believe."
Olin shook his head, a slow, sad motion.
"A most paranoid, if predictably human, conclusion."
Gage exchanged a glance with Reed. Her smirk was a razor blade. Paranoia, he knew, was just experience that hadn't killed you yet. The Celestial Quill was less a ship and more a city sealed in a bottle. The human contingent found itself quartered in a purpose-built biodome, a sterile, flawless simulation of an idealized Earth. The gravity was a precise 1G, The air was a carefully managed blend of nitrogen and oxygen, but it was all profoundly wrong. The air lacked the familiar sense of life. No rain on hot pavement, no diesel fumes, no distant aroma of cooking. The illumination was a constant, soft, shadowless glow that scraped at Gage's nerves. He was a creature who understood the tactical value of corners and shadows. This place had been designed without them. The only sounds were the gentle, melodic chimes that marked the passage of standardized time segments and the whisper-quiet hum of atmospheric circulation. It was the sound of a well-appointed mausoleum. Monroe was losing her mind with a quiet, shimmering intensity. She paced the biodome, her eyes fixed on the sealed maintenance panels lining the walls. They were smooth and seamless, with no visible bolts, latches, or access points. She could feel the thrum of immense power behind them, a siren's call of alien engineering she was forbidden to even observe. She'd spent 3 days attempting to coax a Sibelian maintenance drone into letting her see a simple power schematic. She had been politely informed that unqualified biologicals are not permitted in proximity to primary energy conduits.
Unqualified?
She muttered for the 20th time, glaring at a panel as if she could melt it with sheer willpower.
I once built a functioning railgun out of a salvaged MRI machine and a string of commercial-grade Christmas lights. Show me an unqualified biological.
Reed was faring worse. She stalked the biodome's perimeter like a caged snow leopard, her gaze perpetually drifting past the simulated blue sky to the real viewports beyond, where the star-dusted blackness of interstellar space stretched into infinity. She could see the sleek, teardrop-shaped chorus fighters docked in the main hangar.
It's just offensive,
she said, stopping beside Gage.
They fly with no visible control surfaces, magnetic field manipulation, localized gravity warping. It's like they're just asking the universe nicely to move aside. I want to see what happens when you scream at it.
You'd probably break it, Gage said without looking up from the access corridor he was memorizing.
I'd make it better,
she retorted.
Faster.
Gage spent his time observing a habit ingrained by decades of survival. He mapped the ship in his head, noting the crew's unhurried gliding movements. They lacked fundamental situational awareness. Their heads didn't turn when a chime sounded unexpectedly. Their eyes didn't instinctively check the corners of a room upon entering. He didn't see a utopian vessel. He saw a fat, slow, perfectly ripe target. They're livestock, he said quietly, more to himself than to Reed. Living in the galaxy's nicest pen, convinced the wolves are all on another continent. The universe tore. One moment, the celestial quill glided through the serene non-Euclidean transit space. The next, a violent physical rip dragged it back into normal reality. The sound was felt more than heard, a deep, gut-twisting lurch that vibrated up from the deck plates and resonated in their teeth. A klaxon began to blare, a discordant, panicked shriek utterly alien to the ship's usual melodic chimes. Emergency lights threw the corridors into a sickly red bath. Through the main viewports, the stars were no longer serene points of light. They were blotted out by a swarm of ships that erupted from the blackness like a pack of starving hyenas. They were the antithesis of the chorus's elegant designs, brutal, jagged assemblages of scrap metal and exposed conduits bristling with mismatched weapon pods. Warlord Drogg's Ravager scouting fleet had arrived. Their stolen chorus interdiction drive had functioned flawlessly. Bolts of plasma, the color of gangrene, and glittering streams of kinetic slugs hammered the Quill's shields. The impacts were silent in the vacuum, but the ship itself screamed, the deck heaving like a dying beast. The alien crew, for all their advanced technology, reacted with a rigid, predictable terror. They followed their doctrine for unavoidable hostile engagement, which, as far as Gage could discern, consisted of locking all hatches, diverting all power to shields, and praying the problem would get bored and leave. Panic, Gage knew from long and bloody experience, was a tool. You could either be its victim or its wielder. The ship shuddered under a sustained barrage, the sickening groan of stressed metal an omnipresent bass note. Down the corridor from the human biodome, a plasma conduit ruptured, spraying the bulkhead with molten green energy that dissolved the metal plating like hot water on sugar. Olin and a handful of other chorus crew members were frozen, their slender fingers dancing over their wrist-mounted displays, their wide eyes flicking back and forth as they awaited orders from a bridge that had gone ominously silent. Gage didn't wait. He tore a heavy, cylindrical fire suppression unit from the wall, its weight a familiar and comforting anchor in his hands. He had no intention of using it on the fire. "Procedure is how you die organized!" he barked. His voice was a thunderclap that cut through the aliens' panicked paralysis. The humans, engineers, pilots, a few bewildered academics snapped their heads toward him, their fear momentarily overridden by the instinct to obey a command given with absolute, unwavering certainty. "Monroe!" Gage jabbed a thumb down a secondary corridor. "Find a way into the secondary comms array. Get me a tactical layout of this tub. Now!" Monroe required no further encouragement. She was already moving, a feral grin plastered on her face. This was better than schematics. This was a live-fire diagnostic session. "Reed, with me!" Gage commanded, hefting the fire extinguisher like a primitive war club. "We need to secure the hangar bay. You civilians!" He swept his gaze over the other humans. "Stay here! Barricade that door! Find anything that isn't bolted down! If something that isn't us gets through, make it regret being born!" His voice, honed by years of shouting over the din of artillery and the scream of jet engines, was a scalpel of pure authority. It sliced through the cacophony of alarms and the quavering, uncertain orders still trickling over the ship's internal comms. Olin watched, his mouth slightly agape, as this supposedly primitive being, this anomaly, organized his terrified people into a disturbingly effective fighting unit in less than 30 seconds. This was something beyond mere command. It was a display of pure predatory instinct. Down in a secondary engineering hub, smoke and the acrid stench of fried electronics choked the air. The ship's automated point defense cannons were offline, their primary power conduits severed in the initial assault. 2 Cybelian technicians were frantically running diagnostics, their slender fingers a blur over holographic interfaces that showed cascading system failures in angry red glyphs. They were attempting to comprehend the problem. Dr. Ellen Monroe arrived like a hurricane in a lab coat. She shoved past them, her eyes scanning the exposed guts of the ship with an intensity that made the aliens flinch away.
"Diagnostics are a waste of time when the patient is actively bleeding out on the table," she muttered.
She located the main junction for the weapon systems. With a grunt, she ripped a maintenance panel straight off the wall, ignoring the shower of sparks and the horrified gasps from the Cybelians. A thicket of woven light fibers and glowing power relays was revealed.
"By the Founder's first song! What are you doing?"
One of the technicians shrieked, its voice escalating in pitch. Monroe ignored him. She grabbed a heavy metal pry bar from a nearby toolkit.
"The connectors are incompatible, but the underlying conduits are standardized. All I need is to bypass this idiot-proof safety interface." "That would violate 38 distinct safety regulations,"
the other technician wailed.
"You could overload the entire sector grid."
"Good," Monroe said. With a grunt of effort, she used the pry bar to physically jam a bypass shunt into place, forcing a connection between an auxiliary life support system and the weapon's capacitor bank. The lights in the entire engineering sector dimmed to a dull brown, and the hum of the ship's systems dropped to full octave. The Cybelians shrieked again as their diagnostic screens went black. But a moment later, a deep, resonant thump, thump, thump echoed through the hull. The ship's external point defense cannons roared back to life, spitting torrents of emerald energy into the Ravager swarm. Monroe wiped a smear of grease from her cheek and gave the sparking, groaning console a satisfied pat.
"Percussive maintenance," she declared to the stunned aliens. "Sometimes you just have to hit the thing."
From the hangar observation deck, the battle was a chaotic ballet of light and death. Reed watched with the Predator's focus, her knuckles white where she gripped the railing. The chorus's sleek interceptors were being systematically slaughtered. They flew with textbook grace, executing perfect, predictable, evasive maneuvers that the Ravagers, flying with the vicious, swarming logic of piranhas, easily countered. Olin finally caught up, his usually serene face pale and beaded with sweat.
"Sergeant, we must get your people to the designated safe zone in the ship's core. It is the most heavily armored section."
"Useless,"
Reed cut him off, her eyes never leaving the dogfight outside.
"A cage is a cage. Doesn't matter how thick the bars are."
Her gaze swept across the cavernous hangar bay and landed on a heavy, blocky, unapologetically ugly vehicle tucked away in a corner. An atmospheric cargo hauler, armored for hazardous environment entry.
That,
Reed said, pointing.
I need that.
Olin followed her finger, his expression shifting from panic to sheer disbelief.
That is a Class 9 orbital tug. It has no weapons, no advanced shielding. It is a brick.
Reed finally turned to look at him, and her face was split by a wicked, adrenaline-fueled grin that made the envoy take an involuntary step backward.
Exactly, she said. Bricks hurt when you throw them hard enough.
Before Olin could form a coherent response, she was gone. She sprinted across the deck, vaulted over a supply crate with the practiced ease of an athlete, and slid into the pilot's seat of the hauler. Its cockpit was Spartan, designed for function, not finesse. It felt like home. The main hangar doors, never designed for rapid deployment, groaned open with agonizing slowness. The cargo hauler didn't wait for them to fully retract. Reed slammed the throttle forward, and the overpowered engines roared to life. The tug blasted out of the hangar, scraping its shoulder against the still-moving door with a screech of tortured metal that set Olin's sensitive auditory organs on edge. Out in the black, she didn't dogfight. That was for artists. This was a demolition derby. While the alien fighters moved like fencers, all elegant parries and precise thrusts, Reed used Newtonian physics like a cudgel. A Ravager fighter, a nimble scorpion-like craft, zipped in, its cannons blazing. Reed didn't dodge, she bulldozed. She angled the hauler's heavily armored prow and simply smashed the smaller ship into a cloud of glittering shrapnel, ignoring the cosmetic damage to her own hull as debris rained against her viewport. The Ravager flagship, a cruiser named the Carrion, was lining up a killing blow on the crippled Celestial Quill. Just as its main weapon began to glow, Monroe's voice, tinny and laced with static, crackled over a jury-rigged comm channel.
Reed, you see that big communication spire on the dorsal side of their bridge? The long pointy bit that looks like an oversized designed hood ornament? Yeah, I see it. What about it?
Reed grunted, wrestling with the controls as she sideswiped another Ravager.
It's a design flaw, a massive one. I've seen it on 3 of their ship classes from the sensor scans. The main power relays for their entire bridge and targeting systems run right through the base with minimal shielding. It's monumentally stupid. Hit it! Now you're speaking my language,
Reed laughed, a wild, joyous sound. She wrenched the hauler into a terrifying, uncontrolled spin, its engines screaming in protest. It wasn't a maneuver, it was a controlled fall. She aimed the nose of her ship, a battering ram of reinforced durasteel, directly at the base of the spire. The hauler slammed into the Carrion with the force of a small asteroid. The spire shattered, sending a wave of blue energy cascading across the Ravager cruiser's bridge, blowing out every console, blinding its sensors, and crippling its command and control functions. The cargo hauler, its entire front end a mangled wreck of twisted metal, tumbled away into space, silent and powerless. Inside, strapped into her chair and laughing breathlessly, Iona Reed looked at the chaos she had wrought and thought,
totally worth it.
Blind and enraged, the Ravager captain, Warlord Drog, abandoned all pretense of tactics. He roared a single command into his ship's comms.
Board them! I want their captain's head on a spike!
A brutish, drill-tipped boarding torpedo launched from the Carrion's flank. It punched through the Quill's hull with a deafening shriek of tearing metal, embedding itself in a primary access corridor. As the drill retracted, a shimmering atmospheric gasket deployed around the breach, a piece of brutal but effective Ravager tech to keep the air in. 6 Cybelian officers in gleaming silver armor formed a perfect, disciplined firing line down the corridor, their plasma rifles raised. The torpedo's ramp slammed down, and a tide of berserk fury poured out. The Ravagers were huge, hulking brutes in mismatched heavy armor, roaring as they charged. They wielded vibroaxes, power mauls, and jagged metal claws. The Cybelian line fired in controlled, elegant volleys. Their plasma bolts left neat, quarterized holes in the bulkhead and occasionally in a Ravager. But the pirates charged through the fire, their crude personal shields flaring and dying as they absorbed the hits. They were a wave of pure aggression, and the disciplined chorus line was a sandcastle against a tsunami. The Ravagers closed the distance in seconds, and the neat firing line dissolved into a maelstrom of screams and brutal close-quarters combat. The Cybelians, trained for ranged, honorable engagement, were cut down where they stood. Gage arrived just as the lost chorus officer fell. He wasn't alone. He had a dozen other humans with him, engineers, technicians, even a botanist, all armed with scavenged tools, heavy wrenches, pry bars, and in Gage's hands, a maintenance shotgun loaded with industrial slugs designed for breaking rock. They didn't form a line. That was suicide. "Choke point, now!" Gage yelled. He pointed to a narrow intersection where a maintenance scaffold partially blocked the corridor. The humans scrambled into positions of opportunity, ducking behind support struts and using the scaffolding for cover. It was not a battle. It was violent plumbing. The Ravagers, expecting more terrified prey, charged straight into an ambush. A heavy wrench thrown with surprising force by Monroe shattered the helmet of the lead pirate. Gage's shotgun boomed, the industrial slug punching a fist-sized hole through another's chest plate. The narrow corridor became a whirlwind of desperate, ugly violence. The humans fought like cornered badgers with a ferocity that stunned the Ravagers. They didn't fight with honor. They fought to put the other guy down, permanently and by any means necessary. The fight climaxed as Gage confronted the enormous Ravager boarding leader, a mountain of muscle and rage near a large viewpoint that had been cracked into spiderweb from an earlier impact. The pirate swung a massive power maul, forcing Gage back against the weakened transparisteel. The huge window groaned in protest. With a guttural roar, the Ravager lunged. Gage didn't try to block. He sidestepped, grabbed the pirate's arm, and used the creature's own momentum against him, shoving him backward. The pirate's massive body slammed into the cracked viewport. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening crack, the transparisteel shattered. The Ravager's atmospheric gasket on their torpedo failed under the sudden massive pressure differential. The air in the corridor exploded into the void. Gage, anticipating the move, had already locked his hand around an exposed power conduit, bracing himself against the hurricane-force suction. The pirate leader was not so lucky. His roar of triumph was cut short as he was violently ripped from the ship, his limbs flailing as he was sucked into the cold, silent vacuum of space. The remaining Ravagers, seeing their champion dispatched with such primal, shocking brutality, faltered. Their bloodlust evaporated, replaced by a sudden instinctual fear. They turned and fled back toward their boarding craft, scrambling over their own dead. The monsters had just met something worse. The battle was over. The last of Drogg's battered scouting fleet, their command ship crippled and their boarding parties decimated, had limped away into the darkness. On the bridge of the Celestial Quill, the surviving humans moved with a purpose the aliens couldn't comprehend. They were patching wounds with improvised bandages, cracking grim jokes, and Monroe was already excitedly explaining to Reed how they could salvage the wrecked Ravager ships for parts. The chorus crew, however, stood in stunned, horrified silence. They stared at the bloodied, adrenaline-high humans not with gratitude, but with a dawning primal fear. The humans hadn't just fought, they'd reveled in it. They had fought without honor, without restraint, and without a shred of the civilized terror that should accompany a life-or-death struggle. Olin stood in the corridor where the boarding action had taken place, his stomach churning at the carnage. It was a scene of utter barbarism. He looked at the crude, brutal damage inflicted by improvised weapons, so different from the clean, cauterized wounds of plasma fire. Gage found him there, calmly applying a crude field dressing to a deep gash on his own arm. He noticed the envoy's expression of revulsion. "You think this is bad?" Gage said, his voice a low, grim rumble. He cinched the bandage tight with his teeth. "This is clean. You should have seen what we did to each other over a patch of dirt in the Balkur salient. At least these guys were shooting back." Olin looked from the blood-spattered bulkhead to Gage's cold, steady eyes. He wasn't looking at a refugee anymore. He felt a deep chill in his core that had nothing to do with the emergency life support. He was looking at a predator that had just finished a messy meal. Aboard the Chorus command vessel, the fleet admiral, Mirek, reviewed the combat data with a growing sense of unease. He watched the footage from the Quill's corridor firefight, his tactical mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The flanking maneuvers, the use of improvised weapons, the seamless transition from ranged to melee combat, the sheer suicidal ferocity. It was all chillingly familiar. With trembling fingers, he pulled up the chorus's most highly classified intelligence file, the Ylem archive. It wasn't a collection of their own data, but fragments recovered from the wreckage of a probe from a long-dead civilization that had passed through this system millennia ago. The data was corrupted, the images barely coherent. He brought up the clearest file, a flickering depiction of bipedal figures in crude metal armor, holding shields, moving in a terrifyingly disciplined block. Another showed figures on horseback wielding long pikes. The tactical signatures, the aggression, the use of terrain, the sheer ferocity were a perfect match to what he'd just witnessed. Then he pulled up the modern human data, the century of broadcasts they had dismissed as entertainment from a society of primitives. He played a clip from a historical documentary about a conflict called World War II. He watched pixelated human soldiers storming a beach. He watched Gage's helmet cam footage from the boarding action. The movements, the way they used cover, the shouted guttural commands, the brutal, final, efficient violence. The ancient myth and the modern reality snapped into focus. Admiral Mirak felt the blood drain from his face. He stumbled back from the console, his mind reeling. The legends, the ancient, terrifying echo data from the Ylem probe. It wasn't of some mysterious alien race. He turned to his first officer, his face ashen.
"It was a record," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The echoes were never another species. It was them. It has always been them."
Olin, his idealism shattered into a million pieces, confronted the humans in the medbay. Monroe was arguing with a medical drone about the tensile strength of her sutures, while Reed, arm in a sling, was trying to convince a nervous Civilian pilot to let her test drive his fighter.
"Stop!"
Olin said, his voice trembling with the weight of his revelation. He activated the medbay's main holoscreen. First, he projected the Echo archives, the flickering images of ancient warriors, of Napoleonic-era soldiers in lines, all taken from the corrupted Ylem data.
"This," Olam whispered, "is the nightmare that has haunted our histories. This is the enemy that forged our chorus."
Then he switched the display. The screen filled with crisp, high-definition footage from Earth's 20th century. Panzer tanks rolling across a field, F-14 Tomcat fighters screaming off the deck of an aircraft carrier, soldiers in heavy gear storming a beach under a storm of projectile fire.
"And this,"
his voice was barely audible,
"is the source. The myth and the reality. They are the same. It is you."
A long, stunned silence fell over the medbay. The humans stared at their own bloody history, reframed as a galactic horror story. Then, Reed started to laugh. It began as a short, incredulous bark, then grew into a full-throated, hysterical peal of laughter. She doubled over, clutching her ribs.
"Wait!"
she gasped, tears streaming from her eyes.
"Hold on! All this? The big rescue? The unstoppable enemy? You've been terrified of us the whole time?"
She dissolved into another fit of laughter.
"Holy shit! And here we thought you guys were the competent ones!"
Monroe finally found her voice.
"So, our historical documentaries, you thought those were cultural dramas?"
Olin just stared, his entire worldview crumbling around him. The boogeyman was real, and he'd just offered it a cup of tea and a blanket. The revelation spread through the chorus fleet like a virus. "We are harboring the echoes. The monsters are on our ships." Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. Admiral Mirak immediately ordered a full quarantine of the Sol system and a tactical lockdown of the humans aboard the Quill. But it was too late. Space ripped open again. Dozens of Ravager cruisers, destroyers, and carriers dropped out of FTL, summoned by the Carrion's automated distress call. They had come expecting to pick the bones of a crippled convoy. Instead, they found a fully alert, if battered and psychologically fractured, chorus fleet. Enraged at the trap and hungry for vengeance, the Ravager fleet attacked without preamble. The Chorus fleet, their commanders now struggling with the crisis of having their foundational myths sitting in their medbay, fell into disarray. Their disciplined formations wavered. Their comms channels were a mess of panicked, contradictory orders. Admiral Mirek stood on his bridge, watching his fleet get systematically shredded. His face was a mask of disbelief as his captains reported catastrophic shield failures. His entire military philosophy was burning to ash in the void before him. In a last, desperate attempt to impose order, he gave a textbook command, his voice echoing with the hollow authority of a man reading from a failed script.
All ships, execute evasive pattern Sigma 9. Reroute auxiliary power to aft shields.
The order was precise. It was doctrine, and it was exactly what the Ravagers were waiting for. On the battle map, Mirek saw it a second too late, a spread of kinetic torpedoes already in position, waiting for his ships to fly into the predictable flight path. Just then, the bridge doors hissed open. Gage strode onto the bridge, flanked by Monroe and Reed. He ignored the guards. His eyes were already locked on the battle map. "Comms!" Gage bellowed, pointing at the screen. "Tell the Tranquil Blade to break formation! Now! That vector is a kill box!" The comms officer looked at Mirek, who was frozen in horror. The Admiral was too slow to react. The Tranquil Blade executed pattern Sigma 9 with perfect, disciplined animosity and flew directly into the torpedo spread. It vanished in a silent, blossoming flower of white-hot plasma. Mirek stumbled back, his face crumbling. The primitive had been right. Gage didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask for command. He took it. "You, frigate wing, get in close. Use their capital ship's hulls as cover. Scrape the paint if you have to," he roared at the tactical officer. He jabbed a finger at another part of the display. "Cruiser Serenity, vent your port plasma coils, now! Blind them!" The commands were insane. They violated every rule of engagement, but they were orders given with absolute certainty in a moment of pure chaos. The chorus captains, their own doctrine failing them, heard a confident voice cutting through the noise. They listened. Admiral Mirek, stunned and broken, didn't stop him. Gage keyed the fleet-wide channel, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of 10,000 years of warfare. "Listen up! This is Sergeant Major Gage of the Terran species. You've spent your lives scared of a ghost story. Well, the ghosts are here, and for today, we're on your side." He paused, letting the shock settle. "You think we're monsters? You're right. We are. We've had to be. We fight like this because we fought each other for our entire history. We have perfected the art of killing our own brothers over scraps of mud and misplaced pride. For 10 millennia, our brightest minds have been dedicated to finding newer, better, more efficient ways to kill each other." His voice dropped. "Now, for the very first time, we get to point that fury, all of it, in the same direction. We aren't going to fight clean. We aren't going to fight fair. We are going to fight to survive, and I pity anything that gets in our way." A profound, terrified silence answered him. Then a shaky voice from a frigate captain.
What are your orders, Ghost?
A grim smile touched Gage's lips. "Orders are simple. Break them." The final battle was pure, unadulterated, human-led chaos. Gage didn't use formations, he used wolf packs. Reed, coordinating the fighter wings, had them abandon elegant dogfighting in favor of brutal swarming attacks, using heavy shuttles as battering rams against Ravager engine blocks. Monroe, on a fleet-wide engineering channel, guided crews through performing blasphemous battlefield electrosurgery on their own ships, overriding safety limits to turn sluggish cruisers into interstellar torpedoes. They vented superheated plasma from their engine cores to create blinding sensor-destroying minefields. On the bridge of the Quill, a critical tactical console sparked and died. The Sibelian technician assigned to it froze, his hands hovering over the dead screen in panic. "Report!" Gage barked. Olin, standing nearby, hesitated for only a second. He remembered Monroe's words in the engineering bay. Percussive maintenance. Before he even knew what he was doing, he slammed his fist down hard on the top of the console. It flickered violently, sizzled, and then the screen blinked back to life. Olin stared at his hand, then at Gage, a new terrible understanding dawning in his eyes. He wasn't just watching the monsters fight, he was learning their language. The aliens, guided by the raw survival-driven logic of their human commanders, fought with a newfound, terrified ferocity. The Ravagers, expecting a civilized battle, found themselves caught in a barroom brawl with a supernova. They shattered. In the aftermath, the chorus was victorious. Their celebration was muted, replaced by a profound sense of awe and terror. Admiral Mirek approached Gage on the bridge, surrounded by the wreckage of 2 fleets. He no longer looked at the human with fear or pity, but with a weary, deep-seated respect.
"We built our entire culture around containing a nightmare,"
the Admiral said, his voice heavy.
"We never imagined,"
he looked out at the starfield, littered with the dead,
"that our survival would depend on the nightmare taking command."
Humanity was no longer the galaxy's endangered child, nor a hidden boogeyman. They were a known quantity now, the galaxy's new, terrifying, and undeniably effective protectors. Gage looked out at the starfield, at the distant blue-white marble of Earth hanging in the black. A grim, tired smile touched his face. The galaxy had wanted a monster to fear. It had just met the genuine article. A profound silence reigned on the bridge, broken only by the quiet hum of emergency power and the distant chime of damage control reports. Admiral Mirek turned away from the starfield, his gaze falling upon Gage. The fear was gone, replaced by an expression of staggering, world-altering clarity.
"Your history is not a tragedy,"
Mirek said, his voice a low, reverent whisper.
"It is a weapon, a forge that has been burning for 10,000 years, making you what you are. We looked at the fire and saw only destruction. We never thought to ask what was being hammered into shape."
Gage finally allowed himself a thin, weary smile. He glanced at the main tactical display, where the icon for Earth still glowed, serene and blue.
"It's just a normal day to us, Admiral."
Later, in the main hangar of the Celestial Quill, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Human engineers, their faces smeared with grease and alight with manic glee, swarmed over a captured Ravager fighter, gleefully reverse-engineering its crude but effective systems. Iona Reed stood with her arm in a sling, staring lovingly at the mangled, blackened husk of the Class 9 orbital tug. It looked less like a ship and more like a cosmic fist that had just won a fight with a mountain.
"They're already calling the maneuver Reed's Gambit,"
she said, her voice filled with a giddy, almost religious fervor.
"I was pushing for the flying brick, but I guess Gambit is more class."
Dr. Monroe clapped her on the good shoulder, holding up a data slate that was scrolling with incomprehensible equations.
"Klaus, Iona, the stress telemetry I pulled from that hull is going to redefine our understanding of material physics. You didn't just fly a brick, you achieved ballistic catharsis. We're going to build the next generation of ships based on what you did by accident."
Luminar Olin approached the trio, his movements no longer gliding and serene, but hesitant, thoughtful. He looked from the wreckage tug to the humans, his large eyes filled not with pity, but with a new, profound respect.
"Our archives are being updated,"
he stated, his melodic voice now carrying a different weight.
"Your species is no longer classified as endangered pre-stellar. You are now designated a strategic deterrent."
Reed let out a bark of laughter.
"You mean a guard dog?"
Olin considered this.
"A more visceral analogy, but not inaccurate. We spent eons preparing to fight the storm. It never occurred to us to simply ask the storm to fight for us."
He looked at Monroe's data slate.
"I believe I would like to learn more about this percussive maintenance."
Gage, who had been watching from a short distance, finally walked over. He looked at his people, the brilliant scientist who had found her true calling in battlefield engineering, the pilot who had become a living legend, the countless others who had turned from terrified refugees into the saviors of their saviors. He had spent his entire life fighting his own kind, Now, for the first time, he felt a sense of peace, a rightness to the violence. It had all been practice. He looked out the massive hangar viewport, where the elegant silver ships of the chorus were beginning to form a new kind of fleet. They were flanked now by the first ships arriving from Earth, ugly, practical destroyers and cruisers, bristling with projectile weapons and nuclear ordnance. They looked brutish and primitive next to the chorus vessels, but they no longer looked weak. They looked like an answer. The galaxy had spent millennia telling ghost stories about a monster in the dark, a destructive echo from a forgotten age. Now the lights were on, and the monster was standing guard.